When I'm playing my keyboard, especially when I have it split into different zones, let's say an upper zone and a lower zone, I find it helpful if the instrument is automatically selected in Ableton so that my 8 macros are automatically mapped to my push or my Launchkey 49. If you're not using a push or Ableton or a Launchkey 49, this chapter probably won't have much to offer you. However, if you are using those kinds of devices, especially if you're just using Ableton, you're going to find this an essential value to improving the overall workflow of your live performance and composition. I've created a demo Ableton set that you can download as a supplementary resource with this particular lesson, and I've added a new group track called Auto Select Rack. It contains 3 yellow channels. The first channel, In, that represents MIDI signal. The second channel, Select Rack 1, that actually manipulates any of the content that comes into the MIDI in channel so that it creates a single MIDI note with a single MIDI velocity. The third of the yellow channels is called Illuminate Rack 1 LED. This works in tandem with the LED pads on my Launchpad 49 to illuminate a specific pad with the color purple when a note is being used on that specific channel. So here's the 360 view. As I'm playing the zones on my Launchkey 49, I'm also getting LED feedback telling me which MIDI channel is actually being used. So how does this all work? It's quite simple, provided that you have a Mac and provided that you're using Ableton. The first step is to have one channel that manages all of your MIDI input, and that's what the In channel does. The second step is to be using what's known as the IAC driver. This is built into the Mac software, and as far as I know, there's not something comparable built into Windows, although you can set up virtual MIDI pads on Windows using third-party software. You're going to be able to set up the IAC driver by going to an application built into OS X called Audio MIDI Setup. Once that's launched, you want to go to the Show MIDI Studio window. There you'll see the IAC driver highlighted in red. If it is grayed out for you or its color is faded, that would indicate that it's not currently enabled. You want to double click it, and you want to add a port using the plus sign. I've already created a port that I call Circle Back to Ableton, and it's pretty self-explanatory what that would do. When I go back to Ableton Live, I need to actually enable that input in my live preferences under the MIDI tab. And here it is. I can see IAC driver, Circle Back to Ableton. I want to send the output and I want to receive the input, so I enable both. Since I'm using this to actually select devices, that's what my auto zone selection does, I also want to enable remote for the input. Now whatever MIDI comes in this In channel, it gets sent out to Select Rack 1. Select Rack 1 uses a kind of ingenious process which I can't take credit for. Somebody turned me onto this back in the day. Essentially, you can use a MIDI pitch plugin to reduce the pitch by 128. Effectively, there are only 128 pitches in MIDI. So this enables us to take whatever pitch there currently is and reduce it to 0. The next pitch plugin actually elevates the value again. Here I'm going to plus 60. Essentially, these two plugins next to each other enforce a situation where no matter what note comes into the channel, the note that comes out is 60. Now my Launchkey 49 not only enables LED feedback using specific MIDI notes, and that's the reason I'm using the pitch plugins here, but it also will represent a different color on the LED based on a velocity value. So I use the velocity plugin here. This is a built-in MIDI plugin to set the velocity to a fixed value. You have 3 modes, clip, gate, and fixed. You can use the fixed value plugin to make sure that the velocity for every note is a fixed value. Using a combination of pitch and velocity plugins, I can take any note input and I can turn it into a very specific MIDI note with a very specific MIDI velocity. Then that track outputs all MIDI to the IAC driver on a specific channel, and then that specific MIDI note with that MIDI velocity that I've designed with plugins is then used on the input side to enable a specific device or device chain. So the MIDI goes full circle out to the IAC driver, back into Ableton because I enabled its input along with the remote toggle in Live's preferences. Then I can MIDI map a specific device rack to that MIDI note. By MIDI mapping that MIDI note to the on-off switch of a specific device rack, I can essentially make sure I know which device rack is enabled based on which zone in my keyboard I'm currently using. I suggest loading up the demo song Ableton Set that is a supplementary resource with this lecture. If you have further questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me and ask. I'd be happy to make a little bit more of a deeper explanation for those who need it. By enabling and disabling a specific MIDI rack, we ensure that our 8 macros, especially if you're using a push or a Launchkey 49, are immediately mapped to the most current instrument, the one that was most recently played. That's it for now. I've got a few more ideas for you to consider in the next lesson, and then we're going to do a final assessment, a quiz, and move on to the conclusion of the course.